My name is Ernest Gruening. Many of you know me personally. I was governor of Alaska from 1939 to 1953. I first came to Alaska 20 years ago, in 1936, and I've been a resident of Alaska since 1940. Now, we all know that during these years we've been trying to get statehood for Alaska. I've been among those who've been working hard for it, ever since the people of Alaska 10 years ago in 1946 voted for it at a general election. We all know that under statehood we will have many things that we do not now have, but which Alaska has long needed.
I'm Win Gruening. I'm Ernest Gruening's grandson.
I'm Brad Gruening, Ernest Gruening's grandson.
I'm Clark Gruening, another one of the grandsons.
Well, when I was younger, I really did not know exactly what he was involved in and what he did until the later years. He was a man who was always busy. He was always reading, typing. I did not understand really what business he was in. I knew he was a territorial governor at one time, and he was heavily into politics. As far as a worldwide view, I didn't realize until later, my later years, who he really was.
Well, when I got old enough to really appreciate all the things he was doing, one of them was after he was no longer the territorial governor and we hadn't gotten statehood yet, he was kind of writing a book about statehood. And a lot of that was typed on an underread typewriter, and he just peck away at that, try to get this book together. It was done in other venues, but a lot of it was done out at the cabin.
Well, when I was younger, I knew he was somebody very important because, of course, we spent a lot of time at the governor's house. We called it the governor's mansion back then, but we'd spend a lot of time there, and he was always visited by a lot of people. There were obviously important people that came to talk to him at all times of the day and night. Even as a young person, I knew that he was pretty important.
My grandfather and grandmother showed up. They came in 1939. They did a lot of picnicking out here. After World War II, he bought this property here. They constructed the cabin in 53, I think, and then they just enjoyed it from then. And then we started to use it, come out every weekend in the summer. It was just a great place to spend with the family and just be out here, waking up in the morning out here, nobody around. It was really, really nice. Nice. I just loved it when I was a kid. Still like it. I still come out here and go fishing all the time in Peterson Lake.
They spent a lot of time out here fishing and picnicking, and they often thought that it would be nice to build a cabin out here. And one day, when they were out here, they discovered a person who had an adjoining piece of property that their place had burned down. And before they knew it, they had struck a deal to buy that piece of property, and they went ahead and leased the property that this cabin is on under the Homestead Act. And my father then did the same thing with another adjoining piece of property. And when all three of those pieces of property came together, that's the property here that you see today. One of the things I really liked to do, in fact, we all did as kids when we were at Eagle Rock, was we used to take the canoe. There was this old Grumman canoe that had air pockets on either end of it, aluminum, and we'd take it out in the middle of that lake, which is what people know as a salt chuck, and we'd essentially sink it in the middle of the lake, and it would sit there right below the surface, and we'd use it as a diving platform. And it was our own little pier that we would dive off of and swim all day on. As long as you stayed in about the top 2 feet of water, you're pretty good. Once you got below that, it was awfully cold.
It had a long and a somewhat rough life. This was way after I was out as a young man. I came back during the legislature, and Terry Gardner, who was another legislator, and I decided we're going to shoot the falls. That's when it's at low tide and there's a lot of water coming out of the lake into the saltwater. Unfortunately, we got caught between two rocks, and it bent the canoe something into a kind of a pretzel, and our dad wasn't too happy about that, but fortunately it was a Grumman canoe. He took it into Alaska Coastal, and they fixed it because they can have fixed anything that's a Grumman. And that canoe managed to have another life. The summers were wonderful, and of course you remember the good days, but it seemed like it was sunnier in those days. And one of the rituals was, after doing whatever you did during the day, picking berries or doing nature walks, and Ernest knew all the fauna and flora by their Latin names and their real names, and would explain what trees there are here and plants and so forth. And we'd often have a fire down on the beach. But the ritual was, before dinner, we'd go swimming.
Start the fire first.
Yeah, start the fire first. Get it really going, because the water is cold.
We had one special rock that at a certain tide it was a kind of a flat rock that sort of angled into the water, and we'd all go down there and scooch into the water from there and go swimming. And my grandfather would always go, he'd be out there swimming, he'd have a great time. He'd always go, toasty, toasty, and we'd just be freezing. It was actually something that we enjoyed, even though we didn't want to do it. It was fun to do.
So we went in, believe it or not, with nothing more than tennis shoes, because you needed a tennis shoes, particularly if it's low tide. It was a pretty quick dip, and then we'd have a little fresh water that you could wipe yourself off if you didn't like the salt, although a lot of the fresh water came around from the lake. And so that was our bathing, and then we'd eat at the table and watch the sunset. Eagle Rock played a big role in our father's life. Hunt Gruening was the surviving son, and he flew Grumman Goose's many planes, World War II pilot.
There was nobody out there at the time. There was a few people. Ackermans had horses and cows and mules, and we used to try to ride those. And it was just a great place to spend the summer. And when the grandparents were there, we would spend almost all summer out there with them. And then when they weren't there in the summer, we would come out with our mom and dad every weekend. The road going out there was just a narrow little road, and the trees were all grow over the trees, and you'd be going like driving out there in a tunnel. And because the pavement ended at the airport. It was just a great place to grow up. There was so much stuff to do, hiking, fishing, chasing Ackerman's cows, and there was just so hide and seek, exploring the woods, just doing all that. It was just a lot of fun and a lot of good memories with the family.
I remember standing there shivering in front of those fires in the cabin that we lit, especially just to stay warm, because there wasn't any other heating in the cabin other than an old oil stove, which helped keep the cabin warm. But the large fireplace that was there was also one of our ways that we kept warm, and it sure helped save us when we got back from those swims in the ocean out in front. My grandmother was really involved in the arts over the years. In fact, she's the one that also made us take art lessons when we were kids. She thought it was very important, and I remember visiting some artist studio in downtown Juneau where we took art lessons every day. In fact, she arranged to have some of our artwork, as bad as it was, placed inside the Nugget, Belle Simpson's Nugget shop, with a price tag on it. And we were there alongside other artists like Sidney Lawrence and everyone else. And she was just as proud of our art as I'm sure she was of some of the other Alaskan artists out there. Our art, of course, never sold. One of the most favorite games we used to play when we were out at Eagle Rock was to play in the skunk cabbage that was up Peterson Creek. And the skunk cabbage could grow, it used to grow over our heads. We were obviously that tall then. And we'd play for hours in the skunk cabbage and in the fern patches. And then we'd come home when we heard the bell ring. It was time to come home for dinner. But we could play all day out there.
Well, for summers, when we're not going to school, it's a place where we spent, at least a week maybe without going to town. The drill was you'd go to the Mendenhall Lake and get the ice, because that's the only way you could kind of refrigerate anything. So it was first the trip out to the glacier, and that time the glacier had, all kinds of icebergs all over. And so you load up with ice and take it out. That was our refrigeration.
The ice expeditions that we used to have were important because of the fact that we had no refrigeration out there. And, of course, everyone knows that glacier ice lasts for a long time. So the ice box we had, that glacier ice would be in there for weeks and keep all our groceries cold.
Well, Edna Thurber was one that wrote the book. She was a great novelist. And she came out, and they had a little party. There were a lot of people around, and Edna Thurber was there. And our grandmothers went around spraying DDT because she was trying to, the author was trying to cover her glass of whatever they were drinking from all this DDT that was being sprayed in the air because of the mosquitoes. The author survived and wrote many novels.
We used to do a lot of clam digging out there with our grandparents. We'd go over to where the boat harbor is now, the launch ramp, and right off to the right-hand side was a great clam beach. We used to dig clams there, and my grandfather just loved digging clams. And, of course, the boat launch ramp and wasn't there then, and there's actually very few people living out there then. We'd bring our friends out with. Dennis Egan would come out with us, and Jim Abel, and I don't know who else we brought out, but it was quite a number of different people. And they'd come out and spend the week with us, and we'd just go out and just be kids. Just go have a good time. I mean, there was just nobody out there. And as Wynn said, the fern patch was a big one, hide and seek in the fern patch. And just, a lot. I did a lot of fishing when I was there, a lot of fishing off the rocks in front. And we used to dip herring. Remember, we used to go dip herring in April when the herring run was there?
When they lay eggs, and Dorothy just loved to eat those eggs right off the rocks, herring eggs. I wanted to tell one little short story about Dorothy and Pop, and I was there, and we went to Amalga Harbor, again, that beach that is about halfway between
Scout Camp.
And Pop, we called him Pop, wanted to go on a nature thing, so we were walking along the old railroad that was part of that Amalga mine. And when we came back, after spending 20 minutes, 25 minutes out on this trail, here's our grandmother, our grandmother, up to her waist in the cold water, just otherwise not much clothing on. And we said, well, what happened? She said, a bear came by and sniffed me. I said, oh,
she was sleeping against the rock.
Yeah, and the bear actually did sniff her. And she took off one way, and the bear apparently took off the other way. And sure enough, we looked, and here are the tracks. So we called it Dodo's Bear Beach.
Yeah, that's why we called it Bear Beach, because she was sleeping on the rock. It was a nice, hot, sunny day, and the bear came out and started sniffing her. So that was.
And when we came back, here she's still standing in the water. And we said, oh, no. And then we looked, and there's these tracks.
Yeah.
So we had a bear that routinely would come up and either open the ice box, because we got the ice from the glacier and then put it in there, and that's kind of preserved things that needed preserving. But the bear discovered that, and he was trying to open the ice
cooler.
box there. It was a stand-up ice box. And so Bob took a can and put a bunch of rattlers and then opened up the door and went, at the bear, which is not probably the best thing to do, but the bear jumped off the porch, knocked the refrigerator over off the porch, and he ran away. But I thought, that's not very good bear advice to go, surprise a bear.
Lucky he didn't knock over the water barrel. We had a water barrel there that stood up on top, and that was our water. That's how we get our water, and then we collect it off the roof, and just regular rain. It was just a great big, like a 55-gallon drum or a little bit oak barrel.
Yeah, it was an oak barrel.
And we just ran a tube down there to the sink, and that was our water. And we had our outhouse was how far away? It was a major walk to that.
Well, the Ark was kind of an interesting story about someone who had wanted to come up here with her family from Seattle, and so built a very large metal boat, which nobody thought would really float and make it all the way to Alaska. There was some controversy about him coming up here because of that, but he eventually managed to get out of Seattle and made it all the way up to Juneau. And his name was, that's when the Satko family came to Juneau. They're an old, well-known family here in Juneau. Unfortunately, during a storm, the boat broke loose and came and actually ended up on the rocks in front of the cabin. And it was never recovered. It just stayed there and slowly deteriorated over time, but it became a great playhouse for us. And as kids, we used to play on it all the time. We'd picnic on it and sit in the wheelhouse while it was still in fairly good shape and pretend to drive the boat around.
And the motor was in there, and that had the cabin on it. The wheel was in it. I mean, it was just everything, you know. And then as it slowly decayed, we used it as a sunbathing platform.
And of course, there's very little left there, but if you look very closely, now today, you can still see pieces of metal from the original boat that are metal girders and parts of the boat that are still down there on the rocks.
But, you know, I mean, the only thing left down there now is the transmission of the engine.
Yeah,
there's nothing else left.
It's all gone.
It's just a great time and a great place.
Eagle Rock is a pretty special place, and the fact that it's been preserved all these years since my grandparents actually built a cabin there in the mid '40s is amazing. And I credit my father with having the foresight to make sure that it was being, you know, maintained by the state over the years and has turned it into a historical park. I think what we'd all like to do at some point is make sure that the public gets more access. I think by doing that, generations of Alaskans to come will get a chance to experience some of the things that we experienced when we grew up there.